Good morning. Welcome to the last Ready, Set, Scale webinar and our last webinar of 2022. I'm IRA, NEEP's Executive Director, and I've had the pleasure of introducing our series of webinars all this year. When we conceived of this series in late 2021, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, then known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, had just passed. The 60 some odd billion dollars for energy efficiency and clean energy investments was so exciting, and NEEP decided to hold webinars through 2022 to showcase solutions and models that could be scaled with this new federal funding. And then in August, along came the Inflation Reduction Act with 6 times as much funding, almost $370 billion designated to climate and energy related projects, equitable decarbonization, and achieving the goals of the Justice 40 initiative. Next year, we'll see guidance and that funding will start to be released. So there's going to be a lot more Ready, Set, Scaling than we imagined back in 2021. And we look forward to continuing these webinars with content tailored to the opportunities of 2023 and beyond. We have a packed program today, so I will turn it over to Erin Cosgrove, NEEP's Public Policy Manager, to introduce today's webinar. Hi, Erin. I feel like we were just here talking about this.
I know, right? Deja vu, 1 month later.
Yeah. Well, I hope you have some relaxed time planned for the rest of the year, because I think next year is going to be busy.
Oh, yes. Busy, but very, very exciting. So, yes.
I agree.
Yes. And so today for the webinar, we will talk a little bit about how exciting we see this all, the excitement that we are seeing here at NEEP and how we see this playing out. Next slide, please. Great. Just a few things to note before we get started. This webinar will be recorded, so if you'd like to see a recording of the webinar, that'll be available online later, as well as the slides. Additionally, in NEEP's ongoing efforts to improve accessibility to both our work and events, we've enabled the closed captioning. The control to disable this feature is located in the lower right corner of your Zoom panel if you'd like to turn it on or off. Again, the slides and recording will be sent to all. Also, just a note, because this is being recorded, everyone will be muted and videos off. So please type your questions in the Q&A at any time. We also have a chat function that you can use for comments, discussion, and collaboration. Next slide, please. Great. And before we get started, a couple logistics. I'd like to thank our Ready, Set, Scale webinar series sponsor, Connecticut Deep, as well as send a thank you to our funders, allies, and state sponsors. You know, as a nonprofit, we get funding from a variety of sources, and all of these sources enable us to deliver this content as well as other content on a monthly basis. So thank you to our allies network, as well as our state sponsors that we work with also. And with that, I will now dive into the webinar. So as Ira mentioned at the beginning, once the IRA was passed, we've decided to really dedicate our work on what we can expect from both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act in the years to come. And you know, the Inflation Reduction Act represents one of the most significant climate investments ever made in the United States history. So this webinar will be a continuation of the discussion that we started back in November, and we'll look at how states, communities, schools, utilities, and program implementers can leverage IRA funding to expand energy efficiency and clean energy efforts. So to kick the webinar off, we'll feature some work that we've completed at NEEP, and we'll have NEEP staff present on some resources we have available to help all stakeholders build a pathway for IRA funding and grow access to energy efficiency in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And then we'll be joined by Patrice Suggs of SEAL to discuss the program implementer perspective, and also to highlight initiatives in workforce and ensuring equitable access that we can explore. So before we get started, I'll highlight that we have a new resource, our federal funding resource page, where you can find fact sheets on the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as well as recommendations for how to utilize funding for communities, rural communities, school, and energy efficiency programs and retrofits. Next slide, please. And then we also have some NEEP upcoming resources. So we'll have upcoming guides on virtual power plants and grid flexibility opportunities, as well as statewide workforce training opportunities. And then we are planning additional materials for specific implementation considerations for grants such as HERA in homes, which we know are going to be are going to need to be thought about a little bit more as we think about how they can work alongside energy efficiency programs. And then finally, I'll highlight that we have a survey going around now just to gauge interest in where our stakeholders are and where you are most interested in grants and funding and what kind of initiatives you'd like to see on the ground in states. And this survey, which we'll share now and then at the end or at the end of the webinar, will inform our work and then also has an opportunity to potentially join a listserv or working group as we go through the implementation of the IRA and BIL funding. Next slide, please. And with that, I will go over our agenda very quickly. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking about different pathways for IRA funding. First, we'll have Cornelia Wu, our building policy manager at NEEP, talk about codes funding. She'll be followed by Chase McPherson, who's our community development our Community Decarbonization Associate, to talk about what communities and schools can do. And then we'll have Aditi Dalal, our Energy Policy Associate, talking about energy efficiency programs at NEEP. And then we will bring on Patrice Suggs, who will be talking specifically about the program implementer perspective and how SEAL as a program implementer is preparing for IRA funding. I mentioned this before, but I'll just say it again. If you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the chat. Patrice and I will be having a one-on-one discussion, hopefully fueled by audience questions. So please put all the questions that you have for her in the chat. And then if you have questions on NEEP resources, please feel free to also put those in the chat, and we will have Aditi, Chase, and Cornelia on hand to answer them for you as the webinar goes. And so with that, I will go on ahead and pass it off to Cornelia so we can talk about codes opportunities.
Hello, Erin. Nice
Hello.
to be able to be here. I'm very excited to speak about funding opportunities for building energy codes and standards, both the bipartisan infrastructure law and also the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide, please. So the bipartisan infrastructure law, back in July, a notice of intent to issue a funding opportunity announcement was issued, and the information we have on this FOA is from that notice of intent. So the funding we're looking at is $225 million in total, and that will be issued $45 million a year for fiscal years 22 through 26. And that is focused on efforts related to more efficient building energy codes. And just to note, because the FOA itself has not been released, the information is subject to change. We are expecting it to be issued early in 2023, possibly in January. Next slide, please. So note on eligibility, state building code agencies, state energy offices, or tribal energy offices are required as part of any team. They can, and in fact, partnerships are preferred. And there are several key areas of interest noted by the Department of Energy, and I'll speak a little bit more about these when we reach recommendations. Next slide, please. So in addition, the BIL has the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program. This is a total of $550 million in funding. And again, its purpose is to assist local eligible governments, states and territories, and Indian tribes. And in the case of building energy codes, the eligible use is development and implementation of building codes and inspection services to promote building energy efficiency. And as you'll notice from Chase, there are other eligible uses also covered under this block grant program. Next slide, please. So getting to the IRA, there's $1 billion allotted to building energy codes. The first $330 million is in grants to states and local governments specifically to adopt the latest energy codes. This is the 2021 IECC, International Energy Conservation Code for residential, and the ASHRAE 90.1 2019 edition for commercial. You must upgrade to each of these two to be eligible for this grant. Upgrading simply from, say, 2015 to 2018, while an improvement, would not qualify for the IRA. It would qualify for the FOA, the funding opportunity announcement that I just discussed. Under the FOA, any improvement from a lower IECC year to a higher IECC year would be eligible to submit for a grant. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, you must comply with the most recent or the equivalent. And additionally, the $670 million is for states and local governments to adopt and implement zero energy stretch codes. Next slide, please. So just to note, it's the 2021 IECC and the ASHRAE 90.1 2019, and it can be a code that achieves energy savings equal to or greater than those codes. It is possible, we've had questions about this, it is possible to amend the adoption of these codes and standards, but the resulting code must be as efficient or exceed. So weakening amendments to the 2021 IECC or ASHRAE 90.1 would very likely result in disqualification from accessing these funds. The IRA is funded for 9 years. So again, we've had questions about this as well. It is possible that if a state is not able to adopt the 2021 or ASHRAE 2019 in the first year of the grant, perhaps they might be able to forego the funding that first year and obtain it later when they do adopt the required 2021 and 2019 model codes. And one note about something that NEEP is working on, the energy efficient home credit, which is $2,000, it's a homeowner tax credit. It requires that the homeowner use the 2021 IECC, as noted above. There's a chapter on existing buildings. However, that's very difficult for homeowners to achieve with an existing home, and NEEP and our partners are working on potential options on that. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about topics that NEEP finds very important and our recommendations moving forwards. Certainly equity, ensuring implementation that all of these new codes and standards include actively listening to environmental justice communities and addressing concerns of bias or excessive burden. Workforce training is a large issue for codes and standards. First, code officials are retiring at a very high rate now. And in order to reach enforcement on compliance, we certainly need more officials to review plans, issue permits, and work with compliance. In addition, there aren't enough energy efficiency contractors to do all of the work, particularly retrofitting existing buildings that are needed to meet our climate goals. In terms of enforcement and compliance, it is a requirement of the IRA, the $1 billion in funding, that there are yearly compliance metrics. So it is not enough to pass the codes. You must have the workforce available to enforce and provide the compliance metrics every year. And finally, in terms of code resources, this is something that we're providing technical assistance to the states in our region. Base Code 2021 IECC or ASHRAE 90.1 2019. Again, working and informing questions about weakening amendments and the risk that poses to funding, and working with amendments that might be perhaps strengthening amendments or equivalent amendments. And finally, zero energy stretch codes. These refer to the 2021 IECC Appendix RC for the residential and Appendix CC for the commercial. And with that, I will turn it back over to Erin. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for all that wonderful information on codes funding, Cornelia. And as Cornelia said, if you have any questions for her or would like to follow up, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and she will be around to answer them. And with that, I will now ask Chase to please come up to talk about opportunities for communities and local governments.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, I'm Chase McPherson, the Community Decarbonization Associate, and I'll be talking about different grants and also strategies for communities, local governments, school districts, and especially rural communities as well, to tap into some of these available resources. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of grants that communities will want to keep an eye on, and this does make it more complicated because especially some of these really broad grants, like the first one listed, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant, it can cover so many uses. You know, Cornelia just mentioned it with how it's applicable to codes. And for communities that want to do kind of braiding and integrating all these different sources, it's going to take a little more effort to think about how they can be combined or where you can pull from. So a lot of the important things that I'm going to touch on are about capacity building and collaboration for communities that may not have a ton of bandwidth to be looking into these grants, applying for, managing, etc. So again, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant is a really big, broad one. Grants for energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements at public school facilities is one that a subset of that funding just had a FOA published, a funding opportunity announcement that I'll touch on in a little bit. Secure Rural Schools is kind of at that intersection of rural communities and school districts. And then I put in building resilient infrastructure and communities, that grant, because it's not from the Department of Energy. So as a reminder, there are energy related grants that are not from DOE. So it is beneficial to look outside of just DOE. And also that one has, it is from the Department of Homeland Security. And that one has a little bit more of a focus on planning and project scoping, collaboration, etc., which not all of these have explicit money for, but is important for communities. Energy improvement in rural and remote areas. Again, there are a number of funds that are specifically for remote community or rural communities, which is a group that often does not have the bandwidth to be applying for these, and often is just not the focus of these because they might not have, a rural town might not have an energy manager, it might have a very small local government staff. So it is going to take a little bit more collaboration and technical assistance. And that leads into the last one, the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers program, which people also refer to as TICTAC. And this is one that is not designed for local governments to apply to, but for nonprofits and other agencies that want to provide technical assistance to apply for. And communities can look out for the recipients of those grants so that they can then get the support that they need. Next slide, please. So some strategies that communities might want to consider pursuing. Writing an energy master plan or a climate action plan, if your town has not already, is a really great step to outlining what you've done so far, setting goals, setting priority action items so that it really sets out a roadmap for your community. Hiring an energy manager. This is something that, especially for smaller towns, you might be able to share across multiple municipalities. And this is a use of an energy manager case that has already existed. I know in Rhode Island, there is an energy manager that works across many municipalities. The state of Pennsylvania hired an energy manager to work with multiple municipalities. So that collaboration can really make these things more feasible. Same thing with hiring a community or regional electrification coach. And the difference between an energy manager and a community electrification coach is that an energy manager is really thinking from the government's perspective, like how are we going to reach our goals? How are we going to design programs and thinking more about municipal buildings and stuff like that. A community electrification coach will work more with residents and talk to them about how they might electrify their home heating and give them more one-on-one support. Work with your regional planning commission. Again, this is not like a way to spend something to spend the money on, but a way to facilitate spending the money. And I know a lot of regional planning commissions do have set asides for helping local governments apply for grants and administer them and plan for them. So they're a really great resource. And then finally, if you're feeling a little ambitious, benchmarking and building performance standards are great for municipal or commercial buildings, and residential energy labeling for residential buildings, of course. Those are both ways to make energy use transparent and valued. And when you set standards, that is like really starting to drill down and reach your goals. And there is different funding that you can pull from to cover planning and audits and all kinds of things for both benchmarking, building performance standards, and residential energy labeling. And you know, with codes, Cornelia got more detailed on how exactly these funds are going to work. But again, with communities, there's so many grants that could be applicable that I'm just going to say there are a lot of existing resources, including ones that I created for NEEP over the last few months. And I believe the link has already been put in the chat, but on our federal funding resources page, we have 3 briefs that I wrote for this exact topic. And there's one on a general communities focus, one specifically for rural communities, and one for schools that drill down more into how these different funds can be combined to cover these different strategies. Next slide, please. And so again, just building on collaboration and capacity building is going to be super important. So partnering with surrounding municipalities to pool resources, learn together, reduce administrative burden, taking advantage of planning commissions and nonprofits for technical assistance that, you know, maybe some that have won the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers grants, and others, you know, nonprofits like Vital Communities in Vermont and New Hampshire. There are a lot of great resources and people that can help you. And working with the state that you're in on grants that they're administering that, you know, local governments are not eligible to apply for directly, but working with states on grants like the energy auditor training, there will be a lot of money coming through state energy offices that local governments aren't directly applying for, but will be really important. Next slide, please. So this is the FOA I mentioned, and I won't go through all the detail, but it's the first chunk of the energy improvement in K through 12 schools. And the first deadline is in late January, and they're prioritizing schools with high needs and reducing administrative burden. And it builds in partnership into the application itself, which is great. Next slide, please. This is a little bit more on the resource I developed for schools and the guidance and strategies that we recommend. So facilities needs assessments, long-term capital planning, some information on working with energy service companies or ESCOs, peer-to-peer collaboration, a lot of the same themes of how to make these feasible, and then also some technical suggestions on planning and goal setting and resources on where to find more information. So my last slide is just a few resources that are big ones. There are more listed at the end of the resources that I created that are on the NEEP website. But the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization, which is a really long name, so they often call themselves the Energy Communities Interagency Working Group, is hosting a 3-part webinar series on technical assistance opportunities this coming January. The White House published a bill fact sheet on competitive infrastructure funding opportunities for local governments, and the Energy Communities Interagency Working Group also had a webinar on how to apply for and manage federal grants. So there are all kinds of resources that you can find from this slide deck if you reach out to Jess and want the slides afterward, or that you can pull from the end of the resources on our webpage. But it's definitely going to require that local governments ask for help and reach out for support. So that's all from me.
Great, thank you so much, Chase. That was wonderful information. And I will just add, as we go from Chase to Aditi, that if you have any questions for Chase or Cornelia, specifically on codes or community implementation, to please put them in the Q&A, and they'll be answering them throughout the webinar. So thank you so much for that wonderful information, Chase. And now I will welcome Aditi Dalal. Aditi will be talking about energy efficiency and retrofits. And so I want to highlight that this is kind of a prep conversation for our longer discussion with Patrice, which will happen in a few minutes. So if you have any questions about energy efficiency programs and retrofits, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Aditi will answer them, and maybe we might even be able to use some of them to ask Patrice how things are going there. And so with Aditi, I will now pass it off to Aditi to talk about energy efficiency and retrofit opportunities with federal funding.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm Aditi Dalal, and yes, I'll be talking about energy efficiency and retrofits. Next slide, please. So first, just some bill funding opportunities. There's 4 that I wanted to highlight, and the first one is the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program, which has $550 million for reducing fossil fuel emissions and for improving energy efficiency. It is a competitive grant and eligible for local governments, states, and tribes. Next is the State Energy Program, which has $400 million for energy conservation, renewable energy, deployment of clean energy technologies in buildings. And then there's the Energy Efficient Revolving Loan Fund Capitalization Grant Program, which has $250 million as loans and grants for residential and commercial energy audits, upgrades, and retrofits. And then lastly, there's the Weatherization Assistance Program, which has $3.5 billion for weatherization measures, such as insulation and weather stripping for low-income households and many other things. Next slide, please. And then going into more IRA funding, the Homes Rebate Program has $4.3 billion for state energy offices for whole home retrofit packages to reduce home energy use. And it covers things like building envelope measures, appliances, and HVAC replacement. So homeowners are eligible for up to $4,000, and low and moderate income households are eligible for up to $8,000 under this program. And then the HERA has $4.5 billion for state energy offices and tribes, and it funds efficient electrification of low and moderate income households. And it covers appliances, installation costs, circuit panel upgrades, and more. And households can receive up to $14,000 in rebates per project. And then lastly, there's the state-based Home Efficiency Contractor Training Grants Program, which offers $200 million for state energy offices and tribes to provide testing and certification of contractors and partner with nonprofits to develop and implement state programs that increase the workforce around these retrofits and electrification. Next slide. So with these programs, we came up with a few recommendations. The first one is to center equity in program design and implementations. Both the bill and the IRA have specific funds that are directed towards underserved communities. So states can create programs specifically targeted at those underserved communities to help increase adoption for heating electrification technologies and more. And then states can also create an educational campaign to inform residents. Because there's so many grants and programs and tax incentives, it can be confusing for a homeowner or a resident to understand exactly how they can benefit from utilizing federal funding. So educational campaigns can assist residents in understanding that and empower them to take more action. And then also states can consider complementary fuel switching and electrification policies. This can help accelerate adoption of, states can look to other policies to complement weatherization and electrification efforts. And an example of this is Maine's mandated heat pump targets of 100,000 heat pumps by 2025, I believe. And then things like home energy labeling, which don't directly increase heat pump adoption or other technology adoption, but because residents would be able to see their energy usage, they can then look into reducing that energy usage. And then lastly, states can consider how to implement replicable programs, which can mean streamlining program offerings through standardized measures performed on homes with similar topologies. Next slide, please. So kind of next steps in implementing those recommendations. The first is for states to coordinate with stakeholders such as utilities, program implementers, and community agencies to identify a pipeline for projects and address any other implementation barriers. Because there's so much funding coming in, states can create a stakeholder engagement meeting to identify how that funding will be used and where it will be directed. The next one is to identify gaps in workforce by working with energy efficiency companies and utilities. So again, stakeholder engagement meetings, and maybe also considering doing gap analyses within the workforce to see where more work is needed. And then identify changes to the current regulatory structures to help accelerate implementation. And that can mean modifying cost-benefit requirements or changing program metrics and targets. And then lastly, states can create pilot programs that center contractors. And an example of this is TEP, which is a contractor-based program that combines weatherization, electrification, and renewable energy into one package for customers, and allows customers to benefit from that bundling. And I think that's all from me, so I'll hand it back to Erin.
Great. Thank you so much, Aditi, for that wonderful overview of energy efficiency programs and retrofits with federal funding. And now we'll move on to the last section of our webinar. And we have Patrice Suggs McFarland joining us today from SEAL. She's the Vice President of Compliance. And she is going to now give a quick overview of what SEAL is doing to prepare and how they are looking at federal funding. So I'll encourage you to please put any questions you have as Patrice talks into the Q&A section, and then I'll come back on and we'll have a little audience Q&A to learn more about this work. So Patrice, I will pass it to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erin. Aditi's presentation is certainly a good segue into some of the work that we're doing. And we're really excited to be at this moment in time where we can serve as really the key piece of the puzzle to make the policy actually have the community impact that we're looking for. So before I talk about what it is that SEAL has been doing, I think it's important to really shape the conversation by letting you know a little bit more about SEAL and really our perspective on doing this work. So SEAL was founded in 2009, and we are a minority business service disabled veteran-owned firm. And we started with a major utility in the Midwest at a time where energy efficiency was coming on board, but it was certainly also at the time of the economic downturn for automotive workers. So getting into the industry, we recognized that that was a workforce that could then be converted to become energy efficiency workers and have green jobs. So it's interesting that we're at a moment in time where we're also able to replicate that. So we've really been at the core of our work, always looking at how we can build the workforce as a community engagement tool. And since that time, we have gone on to implement market rate programs, income qualified programs, commercial programs for small business, as well as industrial sized customers. And we've really found a niche in really getting in communities to mobilize and be engaged for those customers that are typically underserved or left behind in typical program designs. So that has always been kind of at the core of how we have been implementing our work. So as we see these major policies come out that have funding and have carve-outs specifically for equity, we definitely are looking at how can we make sure that we're leveraging our best practices across the industry. So, which gets us into some of the challenges that we've considered opportunities with preparing for the infrastructure funding as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. So first thing I think we all are looking at is when, where, and how is the funding going to come down. So definitely big kudos to organizations like NEEP that are really helping to provide resources and connect the dots with the policy to actual funding opportunities. And so really, we have placed a large focus on participating in tons of forums similar to the one that we're having here today. And we've also started to take that a step further and look at collaboration across different industries with partners that we maybe haven't worked with before, as well as those partners who are also program implementers who may have some systems or best practices that could be leveraged to provide a more comprehensive program design. And we recognize that those conversations are going to be important because once the funding opportunity is on the table, it's going to be a little too late to begin those conversations. Other things that we're looking at is we see that there's the $3.5 billion that is going toward weatherization assistance. But there's also a consideration for those customers that have some deeper structural issues. So there was an article put out by the NPR earlier this year that really sheds a representative story of an elderly couple living in Philadelphia that was eligible to participate for weatherization assistance, but was deferred because of the structural issues that needed to be completed on the house. And so as we are looking at how these programs are evolving and how we can have more impact, we anticipate that we're going to continue to see those customers that really have a deeper need. So it's really going to be important with when this funding comes down, how are we also able to provide additional funding sources for those customers who maybe aren't quite ready for energy efficiency or solar or electrification. And, you know, we have been fortunate enough to have some really great partners that have allowed us to begin to allocate health and safety funds in order to rectify some of those issues. But quite frankly, it's not always enough. So the second key to that is making sure that we're able to, as we're delivering our programs, document what some of those health and safety challenges are, so that when it is time to make recommendations for how funding should be allocated for weatherization readiness, we have the data that really backs up why we need to allocate those funds. And Aditi definitely touched on this, but customer awareness and customer education on how the community can be a part of the process is going to be of the utmost importance. We have been spending months on this, and this is what we do as a day-to-day living, but most of the community is not going to understand exactly what these funding opportunities mean to them. So first thing we've done is really look at how can we educate our current workforce. Those are going to be the advocates that are going to go into these communities to mobilize them and get them to participate in these programs. So we want to educate in-house first so that we can have the workforce that's ready for that, which gets into another piece that we're looking at and that Aditi also touched on is how are we able to mobilize the workforce? So I talked in the beginning about our origin story, you would say, with converting the automotive workers to energy efficiency workers. And so we're looking at a similar kind of approach now with what are underrepresented members within the community or transitioning working groups that would have an interest in clean energy or energy efficiency jobs. You know, even within that, it is outlining that an energy efficiency job doesn't necessarily mean that you're the person that's going into the home. So we are right now working with some partners and running some programs so that we can really outline and streamline the best way to connect job seekers with training providers, as well as those firms that are looking for actual talent. So those are some of the key things that we've been doing across this time in getting prepared for bill dollars as well as IRA dollars. So Erin, that is really kind of the baseline that I think provides enough information on what we've been doing to really, again, take that policy and actually turn it into impact.
Yes, and thank you so much for that wonderful overview. I was listening enthusiastically and also taking notes. If anyone has any questions, I just want to go over real quick. So Patrice mentioned weatherization and deferrals. She mentioned gathering data. She mentioned community engagement and also scaling up a local workforce, all topics that we can talk about right now. So any questions on those topics, please put them into the chat, but I will kick us off with some questions that I have for you.
Okay.
So you are a program implementer. You mentioned that you work in a couple of states, and I was wondering how you see state energy offices kind of taking a charge and helping to ensure that the funding is able to get spent and help implementers such as yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that is the gateway, right? That's where a lot of the funding is going to come down. So I think that with the state energy offices, it is the stakeholder engagement, right? As we're putting together what these program designs look like, if there's a flaw in the program design, then it's going to severely limit the way you're able to implement the program once the program is funded. So early communication, stakeholder engagement, asking those questions, and then also being open to how funding sources are going to be spent. We of course want to make sure that the dollars that are allocated are being used properly and we can have the most impact. But as these programs get a little more complex, some of the standards that we use to determine if this is a good use of dollars may not always be applicable. And I think that is a state energy office position to be open and flexible to some different uses for the dollars.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to jump around a little probably, but next question I have for you is, you said in the beginning that underserved customers are kind of at the core of what SEAL is doing. Could you talk a little bit about how that distinguishes you from other program implementers or certain initiatives that you guys take on to make sure that they're at the center?
Oh, no. Yeah, great question, Erin. So we don't believe that we can do this work without the community. And going into the community and being viewed as an outsider is the number one way to not have any action taken on the programs. So what we do is we go in and we're looking for community partners, community groups, non-traditional community leaders, where are the places that the community is naturally going, and we go there. We're not asking for you to come find us. We want to make this available to you. And so that, if you're going to go to church, then if you see something in your bulletin, that's going to be an interaction on energy efficiency or clean energy, maybe from the utility perspective that you haven't necessarily seen. And we found that taking that approach makes for a much easier conversation with the customers. It's not a forced top down, but they really see you as a part of the community versus you're in the community in order to get something from them. And then it also makes them ask questions. Typically customers are like, why are you doing this? Why would you do this? This doesn't make sense. And if they just get an email, they don't have anyone to field those questions with. They don't have that warm and fuzzy. They don't have that personal touch. And those few things have definitely made the world of difference. And I cannot speak enough about non-traditional community leaders. We've gone into many markets where if you're an elected official, you have the title, but that doesn't mean that you are the person that actually can speak to and get the community to take action. And you don't know that unless you're willing to go into the communities, have the conversations, and really understand the best way to model and present the programs.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to pivot a little towards workforce also. You mentioned that workforce is kind of also another way that you can engage in community engagement. I was looking over your annual report for last year, and I saw that you also offer wraparound services as part of the workforce program. Could you maybe explain what those are for some that might not understand that term, and then also talk about how that program looks?
Okay, will do. A workforce development program without wraparound services is essentially something that I would say is set up to not be as successful. I'm going to say fail, but not to be as successful. Because what we often find is that a lot of job seekers, they are interested in working, but there are personal limitations that don't allow them that flexibility. And so wraparound services are those smaller pieces of the puzzle that will allow a person to not focus on their challenges and allow them to work. Wraparound services that we've looked at are, of course, childcare, transportation, but we've also recognized other wraparound issues that you wouldn't consider, with having to have funding in order to get a driver's license, in order to pay off tickets, have additional dollars in order to be able to pay for a transcript, in order to pay for some schooling so that you can actually get your transcript released. Those are things that's a barrier for people that is not often recognized. So we will allocate, dollars to that. And then a lot of our community partners, which goes back to that, are those organizations and those agencies that are providing that service. So again, that comes with that part of being within the community. So they can have the services, they're the job seekers, and they also have community members that are also looking for employment and provide training. So it becomes really this cool interdependency that happens within the community. But yes, wraparound services as a part of workforce development. It's not just about training. It's not just about giving them the job opportunity, but it's really closing the gap.
Oh, great. Yes, thank you so much for that. And then I will, so I'm going to expand on the workforce a little and integrate the audience question that we also got. The audience question was, what are replicable examples of communities, counties, regional commissions, or states partnering with technical high schools, trade schools, and community colleges to recruit, train, and certify youth or mid-career individuals for energy efficiency and electrification jobs? I was wondering if you could speak to that, or maybe speak to how you guys specifically go about recruiting and training and certifying with the community focus that you have.
Okay, yes. So replicable strategies. There is Ameren, Illinois. I know this is not Midwest, but it is a very, very, very dynamic strategy that we're happy to participate in. And the entire focus is on educating the community about the programs they have, serving underserved communities, as well as training and developing the local workforce. So a few of the different components that we're able to deliver under that umbrella are seasonal employment, training, working with those technical centers, working with high schools. And so with those models, what we're doing is, again, expanding on what you consider energy efficiency or a clean energy job. That's really kind of been the base of what we're doing, educating them on what you can do. If you're interested in accounting, you can have a clean energy job as well. It's not simply, just being the technician in the field. And so in those types of models, what we do are we're building training curriculums that are covering specific topics. And then if there are certifications, like your BPI certification, providing the either mid-career individuals or whomever in the workforce with direction on what they can do with those certifications, where they can go to get those certifications, and then the types of jobs, of course, that they can get.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. Yes, and now I'm going to pivot to a different topic that you brought up, weatherization. I love that you referenced the NPR article. I read that article and was also just very happy to see us centered at NPR and see them talking about weatherization. But you mentioned weatherization and getting around health and safety barriers. I'm imagining that's probably going to be a big issue when we get this funding, because we're not going to be able to maybe enter some homes.
Yeah.
So have you seen any solutions for that, or do you have any initiatives, ideas, or if you just want to highlight where you've seen barriers, we could also go with that as well. But yes.
Yeah, I think we're going to see more, because we
Okay.
have so many dollars. We're going to need to enter so many more homes. And as you go deeper, you're going to have to expand into the homes that are not the low-hanging fruit. you know, and that low hanging fruit are those homes that really need a lot of that work, but the families don't have the interest or the ability to move. Even in the article, you know, he mentioned, I'll probably die here. He doesn't want to move his family from there. And that is a true representation for a lot of the customers. Beyond allocating dollars in order to rectify those issues, I don't know if there's any other way that we can get to any resolution. But within that, I do recognize that we are going to have to consider what are some of the metrics that you use in order to make sure that you're not just throwing the dollars away. Because I know that it could be a challenge and a decision point. Are we being good stewards of these funds if we're putting a $30,000 roof on a house that isn't valued maybe even at that much? You know, that becomes a decision point. But I think that having a pathway for those exceptions, having a pathway for a group or a strategy to make those decisions, because when we talk about equity and inclusion and participating in these programs, that's also a consideration that, you know, we have to think about as well. So honestly, Erin, it's gonna take some money to do it.
Yes, okay,
it's gonna take money.
That's a fair answer. Yes, definitely. You did mention also when you were talking about health and safety barriers that you're tracking data to understand where the funding needs to go. Could you expand a little bit more about what metrics you are tracking or looking for?
Yeah, so even with the dollars that we have allocated, it's always not enough to reach everyone. And so it becomes a practice in aggregating and understanding, you know, what are the health and safety issues? Is there anything that can be done in the home if we don't rectify these health and safety issues? Are these communities within one area? So really getting just that basic customer information, you know, where the customer is, where the location is, what the challenges are. And when you look at that as an aggregate, it gives you direction on certain communities that you need to focus on a little bit differently, or that may have take a little bit longer to get through the program, that may cost a little bit more, or it tells you that these are the types of issues that we're seeing across the service territory. You know, roofs are a major issue. If those become a major issue, that allows you to focus on program design that says we need to make sure that we have developed X number of contractors that can support the need that we're anticipating to resolve these health and safety issues, mold, asbestos, roof repair. And that, again, gives you the ability to pivot. So we're not just building a workforce that's going to be able to provide something that is not going to necessarily be as much of a need for the program.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm going to ask a question about data collection, I think, but I'll also admit that it's an area that I'm brand new to. So for the IRA implementation, we're going to need to be able to track where improvements are made, who makes them, and then also just with the deferrals and metrics you were just talking about, we have to track those. How are you guys tracking those? How are you collecting all that information? And is there any data that you have issues getting a hold of, like utility or energy usage data or anything like that? Very general data question. But
no, good, very, very good data question. So we have a tool that we use for all of our customers that documents those key data points. And so we have some standard data points, like I mentioned, just basic customer information, housing stock information, year build, age, if they participated in any other programs before. That information we have. And typically when we're working with our utility partners, we're able to, where possible, get some of that usage data and past participation data. So we really just house it all within the system. But for those firms that don't have that yet, a key piece is in understanding what you are trying to ultimately tell the story with the data of. You know, what's going to be the information that you're going to need. A big piece of it is also the renter versus owning. because that tells a completely different story on how customers are participating and what their journey is like through the program. So that if someone is onboarded and they're a renter or an owner, you have some insight into what their journey is going to be like, so you can set the appropriate expectation with them.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. And yeah, I have to ask now because you brought up renters. I was wondering, do you guys obviously do you work with renters through your programs? Renters are eligible for the IRA funding grants, but also a market that is yet to really be engaged or participate because of many barriers. So how do you guys engage with renters, and how have you maybe found a way to engage with renters more and deliver programs? I'll leave it there.
So we actually have implemented from the top down approach as well as from the bottom up. So when we are looking at community engagement, we're looking at who are the landlords and who are the owners. That's another piece of the community that we engage with, because they are ultimately the ones that are going to have to be in agreement with any structural changes to the property. So we work with them. And then from the bottom up, we still are going to market these programs to renters because they're eligible. And then, typically they're structured in a way that without your landlord consent, we can do kind of some basic measures. If we are going to do some of the deeper measures, now we need your landlord to be brought into the process. And typically, we'll see some customers that I say, I'll take the base measures. I don't want to bother my landlord. But then when they do bring their landlord in, a lot of times the landlords, they do have other properties. And so they recognize the benefit. One key thing that I will state that's important in the renter conversation is structuring the agreement in a way that protects the renter once the upgrades are made. So we do have, programs that we deliver where we have the landlord agree, once we do these things, don't raise the rent for, a certain period of time in order to displace the renter, because now you value your property higher.
Great, excellent. Yes. Okay, one more quick question I just want to ask. It's more policy, step back. So IRA funding is coming down. Have you worked in other states where you've seen policies outside of like the energy efficiency program or utility space really help accelerate this work, or you think would be great complements to this funding?
Oh, that is a big question, Erin. No, so most of the conversations that we have really been a part of have been these dollars. So prior to IRA, a lot of Hope for Homes, which then became a part of the IRA, the weatherization assistance, which now is a part. So IRA has kind of gobbled up a lot of the smaller policy pieces that I think that we were advocating for and working on prior, and put them into this one major package.
Great. Yes, thank you. Yes, so we'll find out what we need as we go through the next year. So with that, Patrice, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion and learning a little bit about the work that SEAL does. And thank you for joining us. And we look forward to continuing to work with you guys.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thanks so much, NEAP team.
All right, and with that, everyone, thank you so much for attending our webinar today. I will just round out with a couple of updates. First, I'll call again that we do have a federal funding resources webpage with guides on it if you're interested, and you can also reach out to us. Next slide, please. And then I'll also highlight we have resources upcoming, and we have a live survey right now to gauge where everyone's interest is with the IRA and BIL funds, and also what kind of technical assistance would be great as we continue into 2023 and see these funds expended. And next slide. And finally, I'll highlight that there is a roundtable coming up. DOE will be having a residential rebates and contractor training programs roundtable on January 12th, 2023. This will be discussing the HERA efficient electric upgrades, the homes upgrades, as well as the workforce training grant upgrades. So if you'd like to join, we put the registration in the chat for you. And with that, I will go next slide. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone, and we hope that you have a wonderful holidays.